My own daughter handed me a life jacket with a broken buckle. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Standing on the dock at Lake Harrow in the January dark, watching the ice fog roll across the water like something alive. I was 64 years old, a retired architect who had designed structures meant to outlast generations, and I could not read the blueprint of my own family's collapse. My name is Harold Beecham, and 3 days ago, I was supposed to be dead at the bottom of a Michigan lake. If you have ever loved someone so completely that you handed them the keys to everything you built, and then watched them try to burn it all down, hit that like button, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about hate. It is a story about what greed does to people you raised with your own hands. It started the way most catastrophes start, quietly and on a Tuesday. My daughter, Claire, called in the morning and suggested a winter trip to the lake house. It was her idea to bring my son-in-law, Marcus. It was her idea to rent the ice fishing tent, to get out on the water. She said I needed the fresh air. She said I had been cooped up too long since her mother passed. She said it with such tenderness, such genuine-sounding concern, that I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for 2 years. I should have noticed that she never asked what I wanted to do, she told me. Gently, lovingly, in the way a person moves furniture across a room they are about to renovate. The lake house was my wife Eleanor's place, technically. She had inherited it from her parents, who had built it in 1958 from a design I sketched on a napkin during our second year of marriage. 3 bedrooms, wrap-around porch, a dock I had replaced 3 times over 4 decades. Eleanor had died in October of a stroke she never recovered from, and I had spent the last 2 months rattling around our Cincinnati house like a marble in a shoebox. Claire had been attentive in those months, almost too attentive, in the way that a bank becomes attentive when you have money they want access to. I did not think that at the time. I am telling you what I know now, looking backward with eyes that have finally been forced open. We drove up on a Friday. Marcus loaded the truck while Claire made coffee, and I watched him from the kitchen window without meaning to. He was methodical. He checked things twice. He loaded the fishing gear with the careful precision of a man who had a plan that extended beyond catching perch. I remember thinking that he seemed unusually focused for a man who claimed to hate fishing. I dismissed it. I was a grieving old man trying to find something normal in a world that felt tilted on its axis. The lake house smelled like Eleanor. Pine cleaner and the faint cedar of her closet and something floral I have never been able to name. I stood in the doorway for a moment while Claire and Marcus moved past me, and I pressed my hand against the door frame the way you touch something you are afraid of losing. Claire glanced back and smiled. It was a warm smile. That is the thing I keep returning to. The smiles were always warm. We had dinner that night, the 3 of us, and a bottle of the Bordeaux I had been saving. Marcus opened it without asking. I noticed that too, and said nothing. Because that is what you do at 64 with your son-in-law. You pick your battles. You tell yourself that wine is just wine. He poured 2 full glasses, one for Claire and one for me. He poured himself a shorter measure and kept finding reasons to refill mine. Claire talked about her job, her book club, the kitchen renovation they were planning for their house in Columbus. She talked the way people talk when they are filling silence with purpose. When I tried to bring up Eleanor, she pivoted gently back to the kitchen renovation. Not rudely, just firmly. A hand on the wheel, correcting course. I went to bed with a headache I blamed on the wine, and slept poorly. The next morning was gray and cold. The lake locked under 8 inches of ice that Marcus had already walked out to check. He declared it safe with the confidence of a man who had been researching exactly how much weight lake ice in January can hold. We got into gear. Claire helped me with my boots, kneeling at my feet and threading the laces with careful fingers. She looked up at me and smiled again. She handed me my life jacket. I buckled it without looking. We walked out onto the ice. The fishing tent was already set up, about 40 yards from the dock, over a spot Marcus said held walleye. He led the way and Claire walked beside me, her arm through mine, steadying me over the slick surface. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The silence of a frozen lake in January is unlike any other silence. It is complete. It is absolute. The world simply stops. I thought about Eleanor and how she loved this place in winter, and how she would have laughed at me bundled up like a child, and that thought made me smile even as my chest ached. We drilled the holes. We set the lines. We sat in the tent on folding stools, and Marcus poured coffee from a thermos, and we talked about nothing important for almost 2 hours. Then Marcus said he was going back to the house for the extra tackle box he had forgotten. He left the tent, and Claire suddenly became very interested in her phone. She said she needed to check something. She stood up, unzipped the tent flap, stepped halfway out. She said she would be right back. She said the ice felt different on the east side, softer, and she wanted to check. She said it without looking at me. I stood up to follow her. The ice went before I could speak. Not a crack, not a warning. A single explosive boom, like a gunshot directly beneath my feet. And then the world dropped. The cold was not cold at first. That is what people never understand about falling into frozen water. For approximately 2 seconds, the shock is so total that your nervous system simply cannot classify the sensation. Then, it arrived. It arrived like being hit by every bus on a highway simultaneously. A full-body compression of pure agony that drove every molecule of air from my lungs. I went under. The life jacket caught me. Whatever Claire had done to the buckle, she had not accounted for the fact that I had clipped the chest strap through the waistband loop in the way Eleanor had taught me 30 years ago. The buckle on the main clasp failed instantly, exactly as it was meant to, but the secondary loop held. I came up gasping. I came up into a hole in the ice that was barely larger than my body, with the tent collapsed half into the water beside me and the gray sky above me and no one in sight. Claire was already gone. I heard nothing for 10 seconds. Then, faintly, from the direction of the dock, I heard Marcus's voice. He was on the phone. His voice carried across the frozen surface with the same strange amplification I would later come to understand as the architecture of exposure, sound moving faster and cleaner over ice than over any other surface in nature. I heard him say my name. I heard him say the word accident. I heard Claire crying. Not the crying of a daughter who has watched her father disappear into a frozen lake. The crying of a performance. Controlled. Rhythmic. A woman who had practiced the tempo of grief in advance. I did not call out. I do not fully know why. Some combination of the cold and the shock, and something older and deeper, some structural engineer's instinct that tells you when a load-bearing wall has been deliberately cut. I pressed myself against the ice shelf. The life jacket kept me up. I pressed my back against the underside of the ice, breathing in the thin air pocket at the fracture edge. And I listened to my daughter tell someone on the phone that her father had fallen through. Then she said something that has not left me since. She said, "I don't think he got the jacket on in time." My fingers found the edge of the ice. It took me 11 minutes to haul myself out, which I know because I counted my own heartbeats as a way to stay conscious. My hands were gray by the time I rolled onto the surface. I lay there for a moment, gasping steam into the cold air, looking at the sky, and I made a decision. I did not stand up. I crawled. I crawled in the opposite direction from the dock, toward the wooded eastern shoreline, dragging myself on my forearms across the ice while the hypothermia began its systematic shutdown of my extremities. The trees were 30 yards away, then 20, then 10. I reached the snow-covered shore and pulled myself into the pines and lay still. From the dock, I could see them now. Marcus was off the phone. He stood at the edge of the dock with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the hole in the ice. Claire stood beside him. She wasn't scanning the shoreline. She wasn't calling my name. She was looking at the hole with the focused attention of someone confirming a result. Then Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. Not the lean of two frightened children processing a tragedy. The lean of two people exhaling. I pressed my face into the snow because I needed to scream and could not afford the sound. The cold was becoming a specific kind of agony now. The kind that starts to feel like drowning from the outside in. I was losing feeling in my feet. I needed to move. I needed to get to the house, to heat, to dry clothes, to the phone I had left charging on my nightstand because I hadn't thought I would need it on a frozen lake with my family. I moved through the tree line. I circled wide. The east side of the lake house property has a storm door. I cut into the foundation in 1987 for the furnace room, a door I had never told anyone about because Eleanor and I used it as our private entrance when we wanted to sneak in late from dinner and not wake the kids. It was the kind of small architectural secret that accumulates in a house over 40 years of marriage, invisible to anyone who didn't help pour the foundation. I found it under 18 inches of snow. I dug with my hands. I got inside. The furnace room was warm in the way a basement near a running boiler is warm. Not comfortable, but survivable. I stripped my wet outer layers and wrapped myself in the emergency moving blankets stored on the shelving unit, the same ones I had packed when we moved Eleanor's furniture in after her parents died. I sat on the floor and shook for approximately 20 minutes while the heat slowly returned to my hands. Then I heard them upstairs. The voice traveled down through the floor joists, with the same perfect clarity that voices always carry in structures I built. I had designed this house to be acoustically open, because Eleanor liked to hear the children playing from any room. I had never considered that this feature might one day allow me to eavesdrop on a murder. Marcus was on the phone again. I could hear him pacing the kitchen floor. "It's done," he said. "Give us 48 hours before you make any calls. The sheriff's office will respond first. They log everything as accident until the insurance investigators get involved. And they won't get involved if there's no reason to look." A pause. "Because there's no reason," Marcus said, with a patience that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation. He was 64. He had a heart condition on record. The buckle failed. "Old man. Bad ice. Bad luck. These things happen." I pressed my back against the concrete wall and breathed through my nose. Claire's voice then, from further away, probably the living room. "When does the claim activate?" "As soon as he's declared, which will be 72 hours minimum given the water temperature. They'll say the body didn't surface. Standard protocol. And the house? Goes to you immediately under the will. The Cincinnati property and the investment accounts take 30 days to transfer." Silence. Then Claire, quieter, almost tender. "He really didn't have any idea, did he?" It was not a question. It was an epitaph. I looked at my hands in the dim light of the furnace room. They were trembling, and not entirely from the cold anymore. I have designed bridges. I have designed the load paths that carry thousands of vehicles daily across spaces that would kill them if the math was wrong by half an inch. I understand exactly how structures bear weight, how they fail, how failure propagates from a single point of negligence or sabotage. I have stood on construction sites and looked at the skeleton of a building and known in my body exactly what it would look like when it was finished. I had built this family. I had carried it for 38 years. I had taught Claire to drive in this driveway. I had walked her down the aisle in a church in Columbus on a Saturday in September and handed her to this man with the specific trust that only a father extends, the trust that says, "I am giving you the most important thing I have ever made." And he had brought her back here to watch me drown. I breathed. I breathed until the shaking stopped. Then I started to think like an engineer. The first problem was temperature. I needed dry clothes, food, and time to recover before I could move effectively. The furnace room had the moving blankets and a shelf of emergency supplies I had stocked in 1994 during the ice storm that knocked power out for 6 days. Canned soup, bottled water, a hand crank radio, a flashlight that I tested and found still functional. I ate a can of soup cold because I could not risk the sound of the heating element. The second problem was information. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. This house had a security system I had installed in 2009 after a break-in at the Reinhardt place down the lake. It was not a modern system. It was a closed-circuit setup wired directly into the house's electrical panel, with 4 small cameras mounted in the corners of the main rooms, positioned at ceiling height where a visitor's eye would never naturally travel. The monitors were in the basement utility room, accessible through the furnace room via a door I had hung myself. The system ran on an independent circuit tied to the backup generator, which Marcus would not know to disable because it did not appear on any of the electrical diagrams I had filed with the county. I could see them without being seen. I found the utility room. I found the monitors. I wiped the dust from the screens with the sleeve of my dry flannel shirt and switched on the system, and there they were. Claire was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, still in her outdoor jacket. Marcus was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and his phone beside it. He looked like a man who had finished a difficult project and was now reviewing his checklist. I watched them. I watched Marcus open a browser tab and begin reading an article about Michigan lake accident protocols. I watched Claire refill her glass. I watched them occupy the house I built with the ease of people who have already decided it belongs to them. Then Marcus's phone rang. He answered it on the second ring. "Yeah, it went fine. Tell your brother we're on schedule." A pause. "No," I said, "on schedule. The claim will file by Tuesday at the latest." Another pause, and then a laugh, short and dry. "She's fine. She's fine. She's better than fine. She's going to be a very wealthy woman in about 30 days. And after that, we proceed as planned." He hung up. He looked at Claire. He said something I could not hear, and my daughter laughed. I had to press my thumb into the edge of the monitor console until the pain steadied me, because that laugh was real. It was genuine. Whatever performance she had been giving for the past 2 months, whatever tenderness she had manufactured, in that moment, she was simply happy. She was laughing at something her husband had said about my death, and it was a real laugh, and it sounded exactly like her laugh as a child, and that sound in that context was the most devastating thing I had experienced in 64 years of living. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I found the old emergency cell phone I kept mounted to the wall of the utility room, plugged into a charger that ran on the backup circuit. It was a basic handset, no internet, no apps, a direct cellular connection I had installed after the 2009 storm left us without landline service for 3 weeks. It had power. It had signal. It had the number I needed programmed into its memory. I called my brother, Dennis. Dennis is 2 years older than me. He spent 30 years as an insurance fraud investigator before he retired to a house in Grand Rapids, 40 minutes from Lake Harrow. He is the kind of man who has never once been surprised by human dishonesty, which makes him, paradoxically, the most comforting person I have ever known in a crisis. He answered on the first ring the way he always does, as if he has been waiting. I said, "It's Harold." Silence. Then, very carefully, "Harold is dead. Harold went through the ice at Lake Harrow this afternoon. It's been on the local news for the past hour." I said, "I know." I heard Marcus place the call. The silence on the other end shifted quality. It became focused, like a lens adjusting. "Tell me everything," Dennis said. I told him. Every detail. From the life jacket to the furnace room to the conversation I had just watched on the monitors. I told him about Marcus's phone call and the phrase, "proceed as planned." I told him about Claire's laugh. I told him about my hands still shaking under the moving blankets. When I finished, Dennis was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. "Don't move," he said. "Don't call anyone. Don't touch the surface of anything in that house that you don't have to touch. I need you to stay exactly where you are and let them keep thinking you're at the bottom of that lake. What are you going to do?" "I still have every contact I built in 30 years of fraud investigation," he said. "And Marcus just filed what is going to be the most expensive accidental death claim in the history of his insurance carrier, because I am going to make sure that claim is reviewed by people who do not take kindly to staged drownings." A pause. "I'm also going to make a call to a friend at the county sheriff's office. Not the local department. A specific friend." "How long?" 2 days. Maybe less. Stay warm. Eat what you have. The moment I walk through that door, we are going to give your daughter and her husband the worst morning of their lives." He paused once more. "Harold, are you all right?" I looked at the grainy screen where my daughter was falling asleep on the couch I had reupholstered twice, in the house I had designed and built and filled with 40 years of a life, and I thought about Eleanor, who had died without knowing what her daughter was capable of. "I will be," I said. I spent 2 days in that basement. I slept in broken stretches, wrapped in moving blankets, listening to the house through the floor. I monitored the screens. I watched the sheriff's department arrive on the first afternoon. A deputy named Kowalski who walked the perimeter of the dock with a flashlight and asked Claire a series of questions she answered with practiced steadiness. I watched her cry on cue, stop on cue, accept a tissue from the deputy's kit with the timing of someone who had rehearsed the exact moment at which grief becomes inconvenient. I watched Marcus stand at the window and look at the lake with his jaw set in a particular way that I recognized from when he lost a client at his financial advisory firm, the jaw of a man calculating forward from a setback. On the second morning, A car arrived that I did not recognize. A man in a dark overcoat got out and rang the doorbell with a confidence that suggested he was expected. Claire let him in with a warmth that was different from the warmth she showed the deputy. This warmth was intimate. I switched to the living room camera. The man hugged her. She hugged him back in the way that you hold someone you have been holding for a long time. Then Marcus came in from the kitchen, and the three of them sat together and reviewed documents spread across the coffee table Eleanor had bought at an estate sale in 1997 and refinished herself over 2 weekends, sanding it down to bare wood and restaining it in a walnut color she had deliberated over for a month. The man in the overcoat was named Derek Sorrell. I recognized the name from Claire's occasional mentions over the past year, always framed as a colleague, a contact, someone at her investment firm. I had imagined a professional context. I had not imagined this. I watched him point to specific lines in the documents while Claire nodded. I watched Marcus lean back with the body language of a man who believes he is in charge of something that has already been decided without him. Then I heard Derek say, clearly enough to catch through the floor joists, "Once the declaration comes through, we file for the property transfer. Marcus handles the insurance side and clears his debts with the payout. After that, we don't need the third signature anymore." Claire said something I could not hear. Derek said, "I know, but it simplifies the structure. One beneficiary is always cleaner than two." I sat in the basement in the dark and understood the second layer of the plan. Marcus thought he was the architect of what had happened to me. He thought he had engineered a clean solution to a debt problem I had vaguely known existed but not understood the scale of. He thought he had used my daughter's inheritance to buy himself a clean slate. He did not know that his own wife and her partner had already drawn up the blueprints for his demolition. I thought of all the load-bearing structures I had designed in 40 years. I thought of the fundamental principle that every engineer understands in their body before they understand it on paper. The most dangerous failure is not the catastrophic collapse. The most dangerous failure is the slow, invisible propagation of stress through a structure that appears, from the outside, to be completely sound. Marcus looked sound. He looked composed. He was standing in my living room reviewing documents with people who were planning to remove him from the equation the moment he was no longer useful, and I was the only person alive who knew all of it. I spent the second night on the basement floor with the hand-crank radio playing low, building my case in my head the way I used to build structural models, point by point, load by load, until every connection was accounted for. I needed more than my testimony. I was a man who had supposedly drowned. My word against 2 grieving family members and their polished colleague would fracture immediately under the pressure of any competent attorney. I needed evidence that did not require me to be believed. I needed the architecture to speak for itself. The security cameras had been recording continuously since I switched them on. The hard drive in the utility room had a capacity I had sized for 6 months of continuous footage, a specification I had chosen in 2009 for reasons I no longer remembered, some vague actuarial instinct about coverage. 48 hours of footage showed everything. It showed Derek Sorrell's arrival. It showed the documents. It showed Claire and Derek in a conversation that Marcus had left the room for, a conversation that included the phrase, "after the claim settles," and the phrase, "your half of the proceeds," and a specific account number that I wrote down on the back of a soup can label with the pen I kept clipped to my flannel pocket. I also had the furnace room phone, which I had set to record the moment I picked it up on the first night, a habit Dennis had drilled into me years ago, because he said the single most valuable tool in any fraud investigation is a contemporaneous recording made by the intended victim. I had Marcus's voice saying it was done. I had the timestamp of the call. I had 48 hours of video. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dennis arrived. He did not come alone. He came with a woman named Agent Torres from the insurance carrier's Special Investigations Unit and a county detective named Hollis, who had the specific bearing of someone who had built a career catching people who assumed they were the smartest person in the room. They parked down the road. They walked in through the tree line. They came to the storm door, and I let them in. Dennis looked at me for a long moment. He looked at the basement and the blankets and the soup cans and the monitors still running, and he put his hand on my shoulder and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Let's go end this." The timing was not an accident. Dennis had confirmed that Claire had an appointment scheduled that morning with Hartman, their family attorney, to begin the probate process. All three of them would be in the house. The documentation would be in progress. The moment would be, as Dennis put it, with the calm of a man who had done this professionally for 3 decades, maximally consequential. We waited until we heard the attorney's car in the driveway. We waited until we heard voices settle into the living room cadence of people reviewing paperwork. We waited until the moment when a pen would have been moving across a document that represented the legal conclusion of my death. Then Dennis knocked on the furnace room door that connected to the house interior. 3 times. Sharp. And I opened it. The staircase from the basement to the main hallway is 6 steps. I have climbed those steps hundreds of times in 40 years. In damp swimsuits after the lake, in wool socks on Christmas morning, in bare feet in the summers when Eleanor and I stayed up late on the porch and came in through the back. 6 steps. I took them slowly, because my leg was still weak from the cold, and because I understood, with the structural intuition of someone who has spent a career understanding how force travels through material, that slow was more devastating than fast. I came up into the hallway. I walked to the living room doorway. I stood there. The attorney was at the coffee table. Marcus was on the couch. Claire was in the armchair by the window, the one that had been Eleanor's chair, the one that still held the shape of her in the cushion. She saw me first. The color left her face the way heat leaves a room when a door opens in winter. Instantly, completely, without negotiation. Then Marcus turned. He did not scream. He made a sound I have no word for, a sound that came from the part of a human being that exists below language, below thought, below everything we construct to make ourselves feel civilized. He stood up and his knees failed him immediately, and he sat back down. The attorney, a man named Galvez who I had never met, simply closed the folder in front of him and set his pen on the table with great care. I walked into the room. I was wearing the same clothes I had worn into the lake, now dry and stiff with lake sediment. I smelled like a basement and cold water and something chemical from the blankets. I looked, I was told later, like a man who had climbed out of the earth itself. I stood in the middle of my living room and looked at my daughter. She was trying to find the shape of a response. I watched her mouth form partial words that dissolved before they reached sound. I watched her go through the 5 stages in approximately 8 seconds. And when she landed somewhere between bargaining and devastation, she said, very quietly, "Dad." The word came out wrong. It had the inflection of a question she already knew the answer to. I reached into the pocket of my stiff flannel shirt and placed the soup can label on the coffee table. I placed it directly on top of the probate document. I said, "The account number on the back of that label matches the wire transfer instructions in the emails Agent Torres has already recovered from Derek Sorrell's firm." I looked at Marcus. "The recording on this phone," I said, holding up the handset from the utility room, "contains your voice confirming the plan to file the insurance claim at 22 minutes past 3 on Saturday afternoon. The property security system has been recording continuously since Saturday evening. Detective Hollis has the external drive." Marcus opened his mouth. I said, "Don't." He closed it. The strange thing about the moment I had planned for 2 days in a cold basement is that when it arrived, I did not feel the rage I had been carrying. I felt something closer to the stillness that comes when the final load-bearing member of a structure settles into its correct position and the entire system achieves equilibrium. Everything balanced. Everything exactly where the math had always said it would be. Detective Hollis stepped in from the hallway. Agent Torres followed. What happened next was procedural. It was the machinery of consequence operating exactly as designed, which I found, in some deep structural way, profoundly reassuring. Marcus was handcuffed in my living room. He did not resist. He deflated in the way that dishonest people deflate when the scaffolding of their pretense is removed. Suddenly, structurally, all at once. Claire did not fight the handcuffs either. She sat in Eleanor's chair while the detective spoke to her, and she looked at me with an expression I have been trying to classify ever since. It was not quite remorse. It was not quite shame. It was the expression of someone who has just understood, for the first time, the full weight of what they chose. It was the expression of a person who thought they were making a practical decision and has now been made to understand the scale of what practical decisions actually cost. I could not give her comfort. I could not cross the room and tell her that she was still my daughter and we would work through it. I wanted to. That is the part no one tells you about loving a person who has tried to destroy you. The love does not shut off like a valve. It just sits there, undiminished and completely useless, an ache in your chest that serves no structural purpose whatsoever. Derek Sorrell was picked up at the county line by two officers who had been briefed by Dennis's contacts at the carrier's fraud unit. His financial relationship with Claire, and the account into which my life insurance proceeds were to have been redirected, had been documented within hours of Dennis's first call. The paper trail was, according to Agent Torres, one of the cleaner cases she had worked in 11 years. My attorney arrived by early afternoon. He was a man named Porter, who had handled my estate documents since Eleanor and I first drafted our wills in 1989, and who received the news of my non-death with the equanimity of a man who has encountered most things human beings are capable of in the course of a long career. We sat in the kitchen, Porter and Dennis and I, with coffee I made in Eleanor's percolator, and I rewrote the will in longhand on a yellow legal pad. The house goes to my granddaughter, Claire's daughter from her first marriage, who is 11 years old and who has spent every summer of her life at this lake and who is currently living with her paternal grandmother in Columbus and who has nothing to do with any of this. Her name is Sophie, and she has Eleanor's eyes and an absolute fearlessness around water that has always filled me with a specific, uncomplicated joy. The investment accounts and the Cincinnati property go into a trust administered by Dennis until Sophie is 25. There is a provision that neither Marcus nor Claire nor any entity associated with Derek Sorrell may benefit from, manage, or access any portion of the estate. There is also a provision, added on Dennis's strong recommendation, requiring that Sophie receive a full accounting of what happened here when she turns 18, in writing, from me directly. Dennis said the worst thing I could do to my granddaughter was let her piece this together from court documents and news archives without a frame. He said she deserves her grandfather's voice, explaining what happened, not the state's. He is right. He is almost always right about the things that matter. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. My handwriting was still slightly unsteady from 2 days in a cold basement, but it was legible. It was mine. 6 weeks later, I am writing this from a rental apartment in Traverse City, which is a temporary arrangement while the Lake Harrow house is cleaned and legally transferred. The apartment has a view of the harbor and a kitchen that smells like someone else's life, which is fine. My leg aches when the temperature drops. My hands are fine. I talk to Dennis most days. I walk in the mornings along the waterfront, and I drink my coffee standing up, looking at the lake, which is a different lake but still water and still Michigan and still cold in January. I have been thinking about designing a small structure, nothing ambitious, a studio, something with clean sightlines and good acoustics, the kind of building you design when you are thinking about the next portion of your life instead of the last one. I received a letter from the county jail last week. I did not recognize the return address at first, and then I did, and I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. I thought about Eleanor, who would have told me to open it. I thought about Sophie, who deserves a grandfather who has not been calcified by what happened on that lake. I opened it. It was from Claire. It was 3 paragraphs. I will not repeat them here because they are private, and because the specific words belong to a conversation that is not finished and may never be finished and is, regardless, not something I am ready to share. What I will say is that I read all 3 paragraphs, and then I read them again, and the second time through I was looking for the structural truth underneath the language, the load-bearing element at the center of what she was trying to say. I think I found it. I think she meant it. I don't know yet what I am going to do with that. What I know is this. I spent 40 years building things meant to hold weight. Bridges, houses, a family. I built them from good material with careful math, and I checked the tolerances twice before I signed off on anything. And I have learned, in the past 6 weeks, that the most important structure any of us ever builds is not the one made of concrete and steel. It is the one made of the decisions we make when the infrastructure of our life has failed. Do you walk into the lake because it is cold and you are already hurting, and some part of you thinks the cold might be a relief? Or do you crawl to the shore and find the door in the foundation that only you know about, and go back inside and wait until you are warm enough to think? I crawled to the shore, and when you are standing in your own living room, 2 days later, looking at the people who tried to take everything you built, it is not rage that gets you through it. It is the same thing that gets a bridge through a storm. It is the understanding that the structure only holds if every load-bearing element is exactly where you calculated it would be. I did the math. The math held. To Sophie, if you ever hear this when you are old enough to understand it, the lake house is yours. The summer mornings are yours. The smell of pine cleaner and cedar and that floral thing your grandmother used that I have never been able to name, all of it is yours. I am saving a place for you at the kitchen table, and I will be there when you want to sit down. The water is not as cold as they told you it was, and your grandfather knows all the ways out of the basement. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever discovered that the people you trusted most were not who you thought they were, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what you built and what you saved. Because survival is not only about living through the cold, it is about knowing which door leads back inside. Hit the like button if you believe the truth always surfaces, no matter how deep they bury it. Subscribe to Voice of Father for more. Until next time, stay warm and check your foundations.